This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 822 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. As a reminder, Late Round Fantasy Football has a Patreon. With that Patreon, I provide weekly rankings and tiers, rest of season rankings and tiers, live stream Q&As, and more. You can check it out and learn more by heading to lateround.com. It's a 15 transactions day. Let's get to it. Add Darrell Henderson and Royce Freeman. So last week when I recorded the 15 transaction show, I didn't have that much information about Kyren Williams' injury. Now we have more information. And that information is that Zach Evans doesn't really matter in this backfield for fantasy purposes. The Rams went out last week, they made some moves at running back, and one of those moves that they made was adding Darrell Henderson. And what we saw in week 7 was Henderson being the 1A in that backfield, which is totally strange to say. But Henderson has experience in this McVay system. He played 58% of LA's snaps on Sunday. Freeman was at 42%. Henderson scored a touchdown, and he saw 2 targets. Freeman didn't score a touchdown, and he didn't have a single target. So clearly, between these two running backs, Darrell Henderson is the add this week. But if you're in a deeper format, or if you can't get Henderson, Royce Freeman is still seeing some work in this offense. Buy Austin Ekeler. So as crazy as it sounds, it does feel like buying into Austin Ekeler right now. It's sort of a risky move. He had that high ankle sprain to start the year. Players don't always bounce back from that injury like it just never happened. Clearly, though, we know that Austin Ekeler has a ceiling in fantasy football, a very good one. But let's just be truthful. Eckler's been disappointing in the 2 games that he's played since coming back from that injury. He scored 10.2 and 5.6 PPR points. Now, if you want to look at this optimistically, in week 6 against Dallas, he had an 87.5% running back rush share. And he had a 16.7% target share. Those are incredible numbers. The problem is in week 7 against Kansas City, both of those numbers dropped. Now that could have been due to a minor injury that he suffered in the middle of that game, but that's still an issue. So again, I'm not trying to sell this as an easy transaction to make. There's no need to pay top dollar for Austin Ekeler right now, given the way that he's performed. This is a buy low situation. And only a buy low situation. Here's the thing. Let's give all this a little bit of context. Back in week 6, like I said, he faced Dallas. This past week, it was Kansas City. Those are 2 of the toughest matchups for running backs in fantasy football. Looking forward, according to my adjusted fantasy points allowed numbers, Chargers running backs get it a lot easier. They have the 2nd best schedule over the next month, and they have the 3rd best schedule from now through the end of the year. And during the fantasy playoffs, the Chargers get the Raiders, Bills, and Broncos. Those are 2 top 5 matchups for running backs, and the Bills, who haven't been in the top 5, they've actually been a favorable opponent for running backs. Now, if you'd rather wait for reports on Eckler's health before trading for him, I totally understand. That's totally reasonable. But a healthy Ekeler, even a 90% Ekeler, should be better than he's been over the last 2 games. Add Dalton Kincaid. Now, Kincaid might not be available in your league, but he's still out there in almost 60% of Yahoo leagues. He needs to be rostered. Not only has he seen a 20% target share in each of his last 2 healthy games played, but teammate Dawson Knox is now having wrist surgery. That means Kincaid is the unquestioned top tight end on this Buffalo Bills team. It's wheels up for Kincaid. Sell Tua Tagovailoa. It might seem a little weird that I'm talking about Tua as a sell because this past week against Philadelphia, he wasn't that great. Usually we want to sell high. But I don't know if the market has truly realized how volatile Tua has been from a fantasy perspective this season. There's no doubt that the highs have been very, very high for Tua. He has 2 performances this year where he's scored 27 or more fantasy points. The thing is, those games, they came against really easy opponents. They came against the Chargers, the top team in adjusted fantasy points allowed for quarterbacks, and then the Broncos, who were the 3rd best matchup. Outside of those games, Tua's averaged 15.2 fantasy points per game. And outside of those games, he's faced 4 bottom half matchups by adjusted fantasy points allowed. That's important to note because moving forward, according to adjusted fantasy points allowed, Miami has the hardest quarterback schedule in all of football. Over their next 4 games, it's the 4th hardest schedule, and in the fantasy football playoffs, Miami gets a brutal stretch of opponents. They get the Jets, the 26th best matchup for quarterbacks in adjusted points allowed, the Cowboys, who are 21st, and the Ravens, who are 32nd. You could have obviously sold Tua last week, and it would have been an even better transaction. I understand that you're selling lower now than you would have sold last week. But even still, given this schedule and given the fantasy playoff schedule, I think he's much more of a sell than a buy. Add Devin Singletary. Look, guys, I feel like I'm on an island right now. I don't repeat transactions very often, but week over week, Devin Singletary saw his percent roster number go from 12% on Yahoo to 14%. It's just really strange to me. It's really weird that no one's jumping to get Devin Singletary. And look, I talked about this last week. Week 6 saw a big change in that Houston backfield. Dameon Pierce saw just half of Houston's running back rushes. Devin Singletary saw season highs in running back rush share, snap share, target share, and route participation. Maybe nothing comes of this. But nothing comes from a lot of the transactions that we make off the waiver wire. We're throwing darts. We're making educated guesses. Why would we not take a chance on a player who has a shot to be the 1A in his backfield? I think he's flying under the radar because Houston had a bye this past week. But if I'm being totally honest, totally transparent, which I always am on this show, I think you could say that Devin Singletary is the best running back ad off the waiver wire this week. And you could have easily gotten him last week. Because of all the running back ads that I'm talking about, he has the most season-long upside. It might not just be some short-term thing. Buy Tajay Spears. As I always say, we should be striving for upside in fantasy football. And one of the highest upside backups in all of fantasy is undoubtedly Tajay Spears. He has a respectable 12.4% target share on the season. He could be usable even without a Derrick Henry injury. But what happens if Henry does get hurt? All of a sudden, you have a very, very usable running back. And it's really hard for me to ignore Tennessee's playoff schedule, their fantasy playoff schedule. They get Houston twice and the Seahawks once. Basically, chances are you can send some bench assets right now to get Tajay Spears. And those bench assets that you send away, they probably don't have league-winning upside like Tajay Spears has. This is the time of year to get players like Spears. And who knows? Maybe Tennessee ends up trading Derrick Henry. Add Demario Douglas. It's been a while since I talked about Douglas on this show. You might recall there was a 10 Trends episode from weeks ago where I talked about him getting more run in this Patriots offense. Finally, after dealing with a concussion, he was able to get that run in week 7. He had a season-high 20% target share, and he ran the second most routes on the Patriots. It was by far his best route participation of the season. New England has a pretty favorable wide receiver schedule both in the short and long term. Douglas should be rostered in far more leagues than he is right now. Sell the Chicago Bears backfield. Roschon Johnson managers, you're probably not very happy. I'm one of them, and I'm not happy. Because that game that Deontay Foreman just had, that was Roschon Johnson's game. But obviously he couldn't play because of a concussion. And now we have a huge problem. Because of Foreman's performance, I'm worried that when Khalil Herbert's back, we're going to see a 3-headed monster in this backfield. That's one reason to not be excited about that backfield. But the schedule's a problem too. Their short-term opponents, they could be worse. But Chicago gets Detroit twice through the end of the season. Detroit's the 29th best matchup for running backs by adjusted fantasy points allowed. They still get Cleveland, the 28th best matchup, and then they get Atlanta too, the 27th best matchup. Without an injury, I think we're looking at a headache in the Chicago Bears backfield. Buy Christian Watson. Now, before anyone yells at me for doubling down on a bad take, allow me to take an L. I liked Christian Watson as a buy candidate just a couple of weeks ago. I liked him in the preseason. Even though the season's not over yet, that was wrong. Because look at where Watson's at right now within the market. No one wants him. So again, please understand that I'm not doubling down on a bad take here. I'm an adult. I can admit when I'm wrong. I just really want to be objective with this analysis. And I do think that right now, given the way that people view Watson, he's kind of a buy candidate. Now, I'm not jumping for joy about Watson or really anyone in this Green Bay offense right now. Chances are Watson's not going to live up to his preseason projected ceiling. It's just that people are talking really negatively about him. People are already labeling him as a bust. But he's only played 3 games this year. In his first game, he didn't see a full snap count, and he still scored a touchdown in that game. He had 10.5 PPR points. In his second game, he caught 3 of 7 targets for 91 yards. In that game, he had a 24.1% target share. There's nothing wrong with that. This past week, he underperformed against a bad Broncos defense. His target share was just under 16%. He caught only 3 balls for 27 yards. Now, if there's anything positive to take away from that game, it's that he was lined up against Patrick Surtain on a lot of his routes. But overall, it wasn't a good performance by Watson or the Green Bay Packers offense. I'm not trying to sell it that way. I'm just not sure that right now, after 3 games, we can absolutely say that Christian Watson's a bust. Has he underperformed? Has he been a frustrating fantasy football asset? Of course. But a bust after 3 games, when only one of those games was truly bust-like? Now, Watson did get banged up a little bit against Denver. Fortunately, it sounds like he's going to be okay. So let's just assume that things are fine from a health perspective. Why would we be buying right now instead of just holding? Well, I mentioned it before, but Green Bay's schedule is awesome. Over their next 5 games, they get the Vikings, Rams, Steelers, Chargers, and Lions. That's the best schedule in football for wide receivers during that stretch when you look at adjusted fantasy points allowed. And like I said, if your last name is Watson, the market generally hates you. Cost is a huge part of this transaction. If the Watson manager's sitting there asking for a wide receiver 2 price tag, of course you're not going to trade for him. He's not deserving of that right now. My stance, though, here is that with my bench, I want to continue to chase upside. And Watson, to me, despite how he started his season, where he was hurt and then he kind of had average games, and then this past week he had a bad game, I still think that he has pretty decent upside. Look at what he did as a rookie. We don't see those seasons happen very often. And I'm saying this as someone who didn't like him that much as a prospect. My model did not like Christian Watson. Your cost to acquire right now, though, is so low. And things actually are set up pretty nicely when you look at that schedule. So I do think that Christian Watson is a buy low right now. Just to have on your bench. You don't even have to start him. But look, if you want to just ignore this advice, which I totally understand, you can just go ahead and add Taysom Hill. How about that? Add Pierre Strong. So Jerome Ford hurt his ankle in week 7 against the Colts. That led to both Kareem Hunt and Pierre Strong getting a little bit more run in this offense. Strong actually finished the game with more snaps than Kareem Hunt had, but Hunt had the better success rate between the two. It's looking like Ford will be out for 1 to 2 weeks with this injury. That's what's being reported. Strong is the next man up in this backfield, and what I mean by that is he's the one who's going to see the bigger uptick from where he was at pre-week 7. I would still prefer Kareem Hunt over Pierre Strong, but I do think that Strong deserves to be rostered, especially because Cleveland's next 2 games, they have plus matchups against the Seahawks and the Cardinals. Buy Tank Dell. We haven't seen Tank Dell on a football field since week 5. Sometimes when we don't see these players get some action, they're easier to trade for. But regardless, Dell's coming out of his bye, and he's hopefully good to go post-concussion. That's great news. He's seen a couple of games this year with a 23% target share or better, and Houston's wide receiver schedule from now through the end of the season, it's 6th best in the league according to my adjusted fantasy points allowed numbers. They've also got a top 5 playoff schedule. I would imagine it won't take a whole lot to get Tank Dell, but sometimes these smaller transactions can make all the difference. Add Jalen Hyatt. So there are 2 very big problems with adding Jalen Hyatt this week. The first, the Giants' offense sucks. It's not very good. On the season, only Tennessee has fewer passing touchdowns than New York. The second thing is that New York, according to my adjusted fantasy points allowed numbers, they have the second toughest remaining schedule for wide receivers. That's not what you like to see. Now, with all that being said, Jalen Hyatt saw a spike in usage in week 7, finally. He had an 18.5% target share, by far a season high, and he got 2 of his 5 targets for 75 yards. Hyatt's a big play receiver. He can get down the field and make splash plays. He can be useful with just 1 or 2 catches. Maybe that's attractive enough during this bye week period. And as we know, rookies tend to perform better during the second half of the season versus the first. Hold Jared Goff. It was a very, very rough week 7 for the Detroit Lions offense. A lot of you might be ready to drop Jared Goff as a result, because he scored fewer than 10 standard fantasy points. But that was the first time all year that he did that. And that's despite the fact that he's faced the 10th toughest schedule for quarterbacks this year. Over his next 3 games, he gets the Raiders, Chargers, and Bears. Now, the Raiders have actually surprisingly been okay against quarterbacks this season by adjusted fantasy points allowed. But LA and Chicago, and granted, the Bears are playing better defensively too, but those 2 teams are top 10 matchups in adjusted points allowed. I think overall, though, none of those matchups should scare you. Not at all. It was just a bad day for Detroit. That's gonna happen. Better days are ahead. Add Latavius Murray. I've mentioned Latavius Murray multiple times this season on the Sleeper Show, but now it's time for a transaction. He hasn't been super start worthy this year, but over his last 2 games, he's seen his snap share around the 47% range. From weeks 1 through 5, that was closer to 24%. Damian Harris is now on IR. So Murray does have some standalone value. And the role would really become awesome if something were to happen to James Cook. No one's obviously rooting for that, but this is football. It's a violent game and players get hurt. We have to think about that kind of thing when we're evaluating these guys for fantasy football purposes. There's always a chance that the Bills try to do something at running back, but for now, Latavius Murray is roster worthy. Add the Atlanta Falcons defense. There are a lot of decent streaming options again in week 8. One of those looks like Atlanta. The Titans are coming off their bye. That's not ideal, but Tennessee's likely not going to have Ryan Tannehill. No matter who's under center, it's a plus matchup for the Falcons. And it's a Falcons team that's coming off a top 10 performance against the Buccaneers in week 7. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. Greatly appreciate it. I'll talk to you tomorrow with the weekly 10 Trend Show.